And this brings us to mistake number 7. And we're talking cybersecurity here, right? So that means that we got to touch upon how we use fear to persuade our readers. And here, of course, I'm talking about not just fear, but the use of fear, uncertainty, and doubt to cause our readers to be anxious. Because maybe we're trying to make them anxious about some risk, some threat that we want them to address. And here's one example. Take a look at this text that I believe is filled with FUD. See if you agree. Let me pause here for a little bit to let you read this. So I'm not sure. Do you agree that this is FUD? Some of you might think, yeah, this is the way to do it. Look, a lot depends on the context and on the sense of urgency and on the facts behind the statements that you're making. But when I read something like big phrases like the assumption of breach doctrine, or words like dictates, and statements like the budgetary might of nation states, that sounds like FUD to me. I want more specific characteristics. What exactly are you talking about? Here, the end of this section talks about enterprises that must rapidly deploy technologies to detect the inevitable compromise, and therefore you should, I don't know, buy some products maybe. Sometimes you see these kinds of words associated with vendor marketing literature. So think about how might you relay this, a similar sense of urgency, but in a way that is perhaps more sane, a little bit more constrained, maybe a little bit more constructive, because what your readers want is they want to understand the risks, but the risks need to be specific, realistic, and relevant to them. They also want to see mitigation approaches that are practical. So here's one way to relay the same intent, but using a very different set of words. I'm not going to give you time to read this whole thing probably, but let me pause for a little bit so that you see one way to avoid the FUD in this particular example. There's still a sense of urgency here. You're talking about sophistication of threats, you're talking about complex technologies, you're talking about the need to avoid catastrophic failures, but I think this is much more concrete. And so my advice to you is to use fear cautiously. Now, you should use fear because we're talking about protecting data, protecting business processes. If your readers don't understand what it is they're trying to protect, that means that they won't spend any energy or money or time on trying to address the risks. They need to understand the risk, and that means being a little bit afraid of it. But you got to be careful with it. Don't overuse the fear when you're framing the problem. So that means focus on specific risk factors that are relevant to your readers. Don't just be broad and talk about the global cybersecurity threat landscape. Be specific. Propose a plan to mitigate the fear. Don't just scare them into saying, oh my God, I'll give you all the money that I have. Please, please, please solve this problem. That's never going to happen. Be specific. What is the plan? What are you asking for? And why exactly do you think it's worth funding your proposal, for example? And just be careful to not overplay the fear card, because if you use that card all the time, people will eventually start ignoring you. There's the famous fable of the boy that cried wolf that comes to mind. And here I also want to make a distinction between the usefulness of fear to evoke a reaction to a specific threat. But fear is very different from anxiety. Fear is good. Embrace the fear, but avoid the anxiety. And the difference is that the fear is a reaction to a specific threat that might have a countermeasure, but anxiety is a general state of distress, and people who are anxious might be scared into freezing and not doing anything at all. So be careful not to cross the line from fear into anxiety. And that means avoiding the FUD whenever you can. All right. Now we're ready for another mistake.